You never expect life to dull itself down to routine, to settle into a rhythm so predictable it might as well be scripted. But that's exactly where I found myself, drifting through days that all looked the same, moving through a marriage that had once been electric but had now faded into quiet cohabitation. Lucas and I had built a life together, raised 2 kids, Noah, our 21-year-old, and Ava, our teenager. But somewhere along the way, the passion that had once pulled us toward each other had fizzled out, leaving only the motions of a life shared, rather than truly lived. I could pinpoint the exact moment I realized we had become strangers under the same roof. It wasn't dramatic. No screaming, no slamming doors, no grand betrayals. Just a slow unraveling. Conversations grew shorter, then non-existent. The affectionate touches disappeared, replaced by polite nods and sidelong glances over dinner. Lucas was still the dependable, reliable man I married, but the version of him that had once made my pulse race? He was gone. Or maybe I was the one who had disappeared. The house was rarely quiet, though. Noah and his friends turned our home into their weekend hub, a revolving door of laughter, deep voices, the scent of beer and pizza settling into the walls. I didn't mind. If anything, I liked the noise. It reminded me of the days when our lives felt full. Among Noah's friends was one who stood out, Adrian. Tall, lean, with an easy confidence that made him impossible to ignore. He was just a few years older than my son, but there was something about him, an energy, a presence. It wasn't just his looks. It was the way he carried himself, like he knew exactly who he was. I told myself it was nothing. Just an observation, nothing more. But the longer he was around, the more I found myself noticing him. The way his voice dipped when he spoke to me, the way his eyes lingered just a fraction of a second too long. It unsettled me. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid of the way he made me feel. It started on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Noah and his friends were out back, their voices carrying through the open windows as they tossed a football around. I was in the kitchen, mindlessly preparing snacks, when Adrian walked in shirtless, his skin still damp from the pool. I nearly dropped the platter of sandwiches I was holding. "Mrs. Carter," he said, that signature grin tugging at his lips. "Need a hand with anything?" I shook my head quickly, focusing on arranging the food, willing my pulse to slow. "No, thank you, Adrian. Go enjoy yourself." But he didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me in a way that made my skin prickle with awareness. "You always take care of everyone," he mused, his voice softer now. "You should let someone take care of you for a change." His words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, like he saw something in me that had been invisible for years. I laughed, but the sound was thin, uncertain. "That's what mothers do." I deflected, desperate to lighten the moment. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir deep inside me. Something dangerous. Something I wasn't sure I could control. I told myself I was overthinking it, that Adrian was just being polite, that his words didn't mean anything beyond casual conversation. But my body had other ideas. The way my heart kicked up whenever he was near, the way my skin burned under his gaze, it was undeniable. And that terrified me. The next weekend, Noah had his friends over again. I did what I always did, kept myself busy in the kitchen, a silent observer to their effortless youth, their easy laughter. I told myself I was just being a good host, that I liked having a full house. But the truth? The truth was I was waiting. And Adrian knew it. He found excuses to be near me, lingering in doorways, offering to help with things I could easily do myself. And every time, I felt that invisible thread between us grow a little tighter, pulling us closer to something neither of us dared name. Late that afternoon, when the others had scattered, some outside, some buried in video games, Adrian walked into the kitchen again. This time, there was no audience, No background noise to drown out the tension crackling in the air. He leaned against the counter, watching me with that same unreadable expression. "You're always in here," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Do you ever stop moving?" I forced a laugh, gripping the edge of the sink a little too tightly. "Old habits. You should let yourself breathe, Mrs. Carter." He tilted his head, studying me. "You deserve that." I swallowed hard. "I dobrid." He took a step closer. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You exist. That's not the same thing." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Because he was right. I had spent years moving through my life like a ghost, going through the motions but never really living. And now, here is Adrian standing too close, looking at me like I was someone worth seeing. Someone worth wanting. I should have walked away. I should have shut this down before it could turn into something real. But instead, I stayed. And I knew, in that moment, that I was already in too deep. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, Adrian, standing in my kitchen, looking at me like I was something more than just a wife, just a mother. Like I was a woman again. I turned over in bed, glancing at Lucas beside me, his breathing steady, his face slack with sleep. He hadn't noticed a change in me. He never did. But I noticed. The next morning, I told myself I'd keep my distance, that I'd find a way to shake this ridiculous attraction, push it back into the shadows where it belonged. And yet, when the weekend came around again, and Noah announced that his friends were coming over, my stomach flipped in anticipation. I hated myself for it. The afternoon played out as it always did. Loud voices, the splash of water from the pool, music humming from the speakers. I busied myself in the kitchen, pretending not to notice when Adrian walked in, hair damp, shirt clinging to his skin. "Mrs. Carter," he greeted, easy as ever. "You look nice today." I almost dropped the glass I was holding. It was nothing, a harmless compliment, but it sent heat rushing to my cheeks. My voice caught in my throat. "You shouldn't say things like that." His lips twitched, like he found my discomfort amusing. Why not? Because it was dangerous. Because it made my pulse race. Because it made me want things I had no right to want. I turned back to the counter, trying to steady my hands. Because it's not appropriate. Adrian leaned in just slightly, enough for me to feel the warmth of him at my back. "I think it bothers you, for a different reason." I closed my eyes. I needed to end this. Now. I forced a smile and turned to face him, willing my voice to sound normal. "Go outside, Adrian. Enjoy yourself." He didn't move. His gaze flicked to my lips for the briefest second, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Then, finally, he exhaled and pushed off the counter. "If that's what you want, Mrs. Carter." And just like that, he was gone. But the worst part? I didn't want him to leave. I told myself that was the end of it, that I had set a boundary, and Adrian understood. That this tension, this unbearable, suffocating pull between us, would fade if I just ignored it long enough. I was wrong, because the next time I saw him, it wasn't in my kitchen. It wasn't with a room full of people. It was just the two of us. Noah had gone out for the evening, and his friends had scattered, except Adrian. He lingered, saying he wasn't feeling well, that he'd catch up with the others later. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself I'd stay in the living room, keep a safe distance. But then, as I was rinsing my coffee mug in the sink, I felt him behind me. "Are you avoiding me, Mrs. Carter?" His voice was different this time. Lower. Closer. I gripped the edge of the counter, inhaling sharply before turning around. "Adrian, this. I just want to talk." But we both knew talking wasn't what this was about. His eyes searched mine, like he was waiting for permission. Like he was daring me to acknowledge what had been simmering between us for weeks. I should have told him to leave. I should have reminded him, and myself, of all the reasons this was wrong. But instead, I let the silence stretch between us, thick and charged. He took a step closer. Then another. Adrian. My voice was barely above a whisper, more plea than warning. His hand brushed mine, just for a second, and it sent a jolt through me so strong I nearly gasped. He leaned in, his breath warm against my cheek. Tell me you don't feel it.
I did.
God help me, I did. But before I could answer, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Lucas was home. Adrian stepped back, his jaw tight, his gaze lingering on me for just a second longer before he exhaled sharply. Another time. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the kitchen, my heart slamming against my ribs, my hands trembling at my sides. And the worst part? I wanted that other time to come. I spent the next few days convincing myself that nothing had happened, that Adrian hadn't been close enough for me to feel the heat of him, that I hadn't let my body betray me, that my pulse hadn't thundered when he whispered, another time. But the lie didn't stick, because every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the ghost of his touch. And worse, I wanted more. Noah invited his friends over again the following weekend. I told myself I'd stay out of the way, keep myself busy, avoid Adrian altogether. But then, of course, fate had other plans. I had just finished folding laundry in the bedroom when I heard a soft knock on the doorframe. I turned, expecting Noah. It was Adrian. Alone. I stood frozen, my heart slamming against my ribs. What are you doing in here? He leaned against the doorframe, completely at ease. Looking for you. I swallowed hard. Adrian, you can't. Why not? Because I was a married woman. Because he was my son's friend. Because this was dangerous. Because I didn't trust myself. I crossed my arms, as if that could somehow shield me from the weight of his gaze. You shouldn't be here. He stepped inside, slow, deliberate. You never answered me last time. I shook my head, backing up until I felt the dresser press against my spine. Answered what? He smirked. Tell me you don't feel it. I opened my mouth, to deny it, to tell him to leave. But then he was there, close enough that I could see the flicker of something dark in his eyes, close enough that my breath hitched in my throat. He reached out, his fingers skimming my wrist, barely a touch at all, but it set my entire body on fire. Tell me, Mrs. Carter, he murmured. I sucked in a sharp breath, every part of me screaming to push him away, to put an end to this. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. Adrian tilted his head, eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought, this is it. Then, from down the hall, Noah's voice. I yanked my hand away so fast it was like I had been burned. Adrian exhaled, jaw tight, but he didn't push. He just held my gaze for another long second before nodding. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my pulse roaring in my ears. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady myself. This was spiraling out of control. And the scariest part? I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. I was unraveling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Adrian. Every time Lucas touched me, absent, distracted, barely there, I felt nothing. But when Adrian so much as looked at me, I felt everything. I told myself I'd end it before it started. That I'd put an end to this dangerous game before it could turn into something real. But then, one night, the choice was taken from me. It was late. The house was quiet. Lucas was already asleep, and Noah had gone out with his friends. I was cleaning up in the kitchen, trying to drown out my thoughts with mindless chores, when I heard it. A knock at the back door. I turned, heart hammering. Adrian. Standing in the dim porch light, his hands in his pockets, his gaze locked onto mine like he had every intention of finishing what we'd started. I should have walked away. I should have pretended I didn't see him. Instead, I crossed the room and opened the door. Adrian. He stepped inside before I could finish, closing the door behind him, trapping us in the quiet. I couldn't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his voice low, almost dangerous. My breath caught. You have to stop. He shook his head.
No.
I don't think you want me to.
I did. I did.
But then he reached for me, fingers brushing along my wrist, his touch sending a shockwave through my entire body. And I shattered. I let him press me against the counter, his body flush against mine, his breath warm on my skin. This is wrong, I whispered, but my hands were already gripping his shirt, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away. I don't care, he murmured against my lips. And neither do you. Then he kissed me, and I didn't stop him. I should have, but I didn't. And as I tangled my fingers in his hair, as his hands gripped my waist, as heat flooded through me like a tidal wave, I realized there was no coming back from this. I didn't sleep that night. After Adrian left, his lips still burning on mine, his hands still imprinted on my skin, I stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter, trying to steady my breath, trying to convince myself I could undo it, that I could erase the feeling of him. But the truth was a jagged thing. I didn't want to erase it. I crawled into bed beside Lucas, the scent of Adrian still clinging to me. My husband didn't stir, didn't notice the way my body was stiff with guilt and something far worse, want. I barely made it through the next day. Every glance in the mirror felt like looking at a stranger. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, half expecting Adrian's name. But he didn't call. He didn't text. And that should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like torture. By the time the weekend came, I told myself I was fine, that it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment, and I would move on. Then Adrian showed up. Noah had invited everyone over for a barbecue, one of those casual afternoons filled with beer, music, and the buzz of youthful energy I had grown used to. But when I stepped outside with a tray of drinks, my pulse skidded to a stop. Adrian was there, sitting casually in one of the patio chairs, laughing at something someone had said. And then, as if he had sensed me before he even turned his head, his eyes found mine.
Heat.
Electricity. The memory of his mouth on mine. I tore my gaze away, my hands tightening around the tray. Act normal. Pretend it never happened. But when I set the drinks down, he was suddenly right there, standing too close, his voice a quiet hum meant only for me. You've been avoiding me. I swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. A smirk. Just the faintest hint of one. I haven't stopped thinking about you, he admitted, voice low, sending a shiver down my spine. Have you? I should have lied. I should have said yes. But I didn't. Because we both already knew the answer. And the way his fingers barely brushed against mine as he reached for a drink? It was a promise. A warning. A reminder that this wasn't over. Not even close. I was losing control. I felt it in the way my body betrayed me every time Adrian was near. In the way my pulse hammered at the smallest touch, the briefest glance. In the way I could still taste him, even when he was across the room. I told myself I was stronger than this, that I could resist. Then one evening he proved me wrong. The house was empty. Noah had gone out, Lucas was working late, and I had convinced myself I would use the quiet to clear my mind. But then the doorbell rang, and I already knew who it was. I shouldn't have opened the door, but I did. Adrian stood on the porch, his hands in his pockets, that unreadable expression on his face, the one that always made my breath hitch. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. He just stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. The silence between us was deafening, thick with everything we had left unsaid. I shook my head, forcing words past my lips. You can't keep doing this. His gaze darkened. Doing what? I swallowed hard. Showing up. He stepped closer. Why not? Because it made me weak. Because it made me want things I couldn't have. Adrian. My voice was barely a whisper, but it was too late. He was already in front of me, his fingers trailing down my arm, sending fire through my veins. I tried to stay away, he murmured. I really did. I should have pushed him back. I should have told him to leave. But when his lips brushed mine, I let him. The moment we collided, it was over. His hands tangled in my hair, my nails dug into his shoulders, and every ounce of restraint I had clung to came crashing down. We didn't speak. There was no need, because the moment we crossed that final, irreversible line, we both knew there was no going back. I don't know how long it lasted. Time blurred, reduced to nothing but the heat of his hands, the way he breathed my name against my skin, the way I let myself fall, completely, recklessly, into something I knew would destroy me. When it was over, silence filled the space between us. Adrian leaned against the kitchen counter, shirt unbuttoned, breath still uneven. His eyes searched mine, waiting for me to say something. But what was there to say? I had just betrayed my husband. I had just shattered the life I had built. And the worst part? I didn't regret it. I should have felt sick with guilt. I should have been scrambling for excuses, clawing for a way to make this all go away. Instead, I stood there, my body still thrumming with the aftershocks of him, and I wanted more. Adrian ran a hand through his hair, smirking slightly. So, now what? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Now what? Now I had to pretend nothing happened. Now I had to sit across from Lucas at dinner, meet Noah's eyes without letting the truth slip through the cracks. Now I had to lie. I forced myself to move, gathering my clothes, straightening my hair, trying to erase every trace of him from my skin. You should go. His smirk deepened, but there was something else there now. Something heavier. You want me to?
No. God, no.
But I nodded anyway. Yes. Adrian exhaled, pushing off the counter, reaching for his jacket. He hesitated at the door, glancing back at me. This isn't over. I clenched my jaw. It has to be. He tilted his head, studying me. Then, with a knowing smile, he said the one thing that sent a shiver down my spine. You don't believe that. Then he was gone, and I was left standing in the wreckage, my heart still hammering, my lips still swollen, my mind still screaming the truth I couldn't bear to face. This wasn't over. Not even close. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that it was over, that I could wake up next to Lucas, cook breakfast, smile across the dinner table, and pretend I hadn't crossed a line I could never uncross. But the truth settled inside me like a sickness. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Adrian. Every time Lucas touched me, I felt nothing. And every time my phone buzzed, my stomach twisted with anticipation, hoping, dreading, knowing it was him. The message finally came late one evening.
Short. Simple.
A thread of temptation woven into a handful of words. I stared at it, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my heart hammering so hard it ached. I could have ended it right there. 3 simple words, and I could have salvaged what was left of my marriage. But instead, my fingers moved on their own. And just like that, I set fire to everything. This time, there was no hesitation.
No guilt.
No second-guessing. The moment I opened the door, Adrian was there, the weight of his presence pressing into me, unraveling every last piece of my resistance. His hands, his lips, the heat of his skin against mine. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, a rush I had been denying myself for too long.
And I let it happen.
I let myself fall. It was different now. No pretense, no carefully drawn lines to blur. There was no denying what this was anymore. It wasn't curiosity, wasn't a fleeting lapse in judgment. It was desire.
Raw.
Unforgiving. Unstoppable. By the time it was over, I was breathless, wrecked, ruined in ways I couldn't even begin to process. Lying in the aftermath, my body still humming, my skin still burning where his touch lingered, I knew there was no going back. I had finally stopped pretending. And the truth? I liked what I had become. The days that followed blurred into something unrecognizable, as if I were floating between 2 lives, one I had built over decades, and one I had stepped into without hesitation. I moved through the motions of my marriage like a ghost, speaking when spoken to, nodding at the right moments, pretending I still fit inside the space I had occupied for so long. But underneath it all, I was alive in a way I hadn't been for years. The weight of guilt should have been unbearable. It should have pressed down on me, made it impossible to breathe, to sleep, to function. But it didn't. If anything, I felt lighter, as if something inside me had been freed, unchained. Adrian and I didn't speak about what this had turned into. There was no need. It existed in the stolen moments, the lingering touches, the way his gaze held mine when no one was looking. It was a secret, but it didn't feel like one. It felt inevitable, like something written long before either of us had the chance to stop it. And I didn't want to stop it. I had spent years convincing myself that love was sacrifice, that marriage was compromise, that passion faded because it was supposed to. But now I knew better. Now I knew what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted, not out of obligation, but out of hunger. Every time I left Adrian, I told myself it was the last time, that I would gather the broken pieces of my life and put them back where they belonged, that I could walk away. But the truth was, I didn't want to. And worse, I wasn't going to. Lying had become second nature. Smiling when I didn't mean it, speaking without saying anything at all, moving through my days as if I wasn't living a double life. It was almost effortless. Almost. I still cooked dinner, still folded laundry, still kissed Lucas on the cheek when he left for work. But at night, when the house was quiet, when I was alone with my thoughts, I knew the truth. I wasn't the woman I had been before Adrian. And I never would be again. The secret didn't weigh me down. It lifted me. It made the world sharper, colors brighter, my pulse quicker. I had spent so many years feeling invisible, slipping into the background of my own life, that now, I was finally awake. Adrian knew it too. He never asked for promises, never pushed for confessions. He didn't need to. What we had wasn't something that could be explained, only felt. It existed in the quiet moments, in the heat of his touch, in the way I ached for him even when he wasn't there. But reality has a way of creeping back in. No matter how careful I was, no matter how many lies I told myself, there was no erasing the truth. Because secrets don't stay hidden forever. And deep down I knew this was going to come crashing down. The only question was when. And how much of my life would be left in the wreckage? The unraveling happened faster than I expected. One moment, I was balancing the lie effortlessly, playing the devoted wife, the doting mother, the woman who had everything under control. And the next, the foundation I had built was cracking beneath my feet. It started small. A glance held too long. A shift in Lucas's demeanor. The way Noah's voice carried an edge when he mentioned Adrian's name. I ignored it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling lingered, crawling beneath my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch. Then one evening, as I was setting the dinner table, my phone buzzed. I shouldn't have checked it. I shouldn't have let my guard slip. But I did. And as soon as I saw Adrian's name on the screen, I felt it. Lucas watching me from across the room. I forced myself to stay calm, to move like nothing was wrong, but my hands were unsteady, my breath just a little too quick. Lucas's voice was quiet when he spoke. Too quiet. Who's that? The air turned heavy, the room suddenly too small. I placed the phone face down on the counter, but it was too late. His eyes flicked to the screen. And in that single second, I knew. He knew. My pulse thundered in my ears. My mouth went dry. The weight of it all, the lies, the stolen moments, the heat of Adrian still imprinted on my skin. It came crashing down in an instant. Lucas stepped closer. And then,